Good afternoon and welcome to the Nora and Edwin Ryerson lecture. There are many lectures at the University of Chicago, but this one is very singular. And it's singular because of the way that the lecturer is chosen. This is chosen by a committee of faculty members choosing one of their own based on nominations taken from the faculty as a whole for somebody who will represent the faculty and the faculty's work in the strongest possible way. Somebody who will speak to the faculty as a whole based on the career of their work and through it thereby capture the highest aspirations of the faculty of the University of Chicago and hence of the University of Chicago. The list of people who have given this lecture since 1974 when it was inaugurated is quite extraordinary. We have the pleasure of having quite a number of them here today. I won't call them all out by name right now, but I think if one examines the list since 1974, you see the extraordinary power not just of the University of Chicago faculty by looking at the collection of people, but the power of this lecture and the collective intellectual power and accomplishments of the people who have given it. And of course, today's lecture is another such exemplar for all of us to admire and appreciate. This lecture was begun in 1974 based on a bequest from Edward Ryerson, who was a member of the Board of Trustees of the University of Chicago for an extended period of time. And not only that, but was also chair of the board for a number of years. The Ryerson family has been deeply connected to the university for much of its history. And we've been privileged in recent years to have one of the Ryerson family really represent the family and speak for the family at these events, namely George Ranney, who is trustee emeritus of the university. So we're very grateful for to the Ryerson family, the extended Ryerson family, not only for this lecture, but for everything that they've done for the university over many, many decades. So today's speaker, as we all know, is Jean Comaroff, who's the Bernard E. and Ellen C. Sonny Distinguished Service Professor in the Department of Anthropology, the Committee on African and African American Studies, and the college. She's also the founding director of the Chicago Center for Contemporary Theory. She's also an honorary professor at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. For those of you who may not know, Jean received her BA in Anthropology and English from the University of Cape Town, subsequently her PhD from the London School of Economics in 1974, and then joined the University of Chicago faculty in 1978. And she served as the chair of the Department of Anthropology from 1996 to 1999. Her scholarly work is extremely broad-based. I'm not going to make any attempt to summarize it all right now, and we'll hear about it from Jean herself. Jean's lectured all over the world. She's received many honors, including being elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. I will say about a recognition at the University of Chicago. She has won the Quantrill Award for Excellence in Undergraduate Teaching. She's won the award for Excellence in Graduate Teaching together with her husband, John. She has won the Lang Prize. So with this recognition as the Ryerson Lecturer, she has sort of accomplished the grand slam of University of Chicago awards. This evening's lecture is entitled Divine Detection, Crime and the Metaphysics of Disorder. And before giving the floor to Jean, I just want to say that for those of us who have known her for many years and have watched Jean, that she really is an exemplar and an inspiration in terms of not only the quality of her work, the quality of her teaching, but the extraordinary, and I do mean extraordinary, energy and commitment that she provides every single day. So she is, in fact, a real inspiration, and it's a wonderful personal and professional pleasure to introduce Jean Comaroff.
Thank you, Bob, for that generous introduction. Thank you, too, to the Ryerson and Rani families for endowing this lecture, a venerable tradition here at the University of Chicago. And thank you, above all, to my colleagues and students in anthropology at 3CT and at the community at large for making Chicago such a uniquely creative place to live and work. This lecture is taken from a book which John and I are currently writing, and it's called The Truth About Crime. Our ideas about crime cannot be separated from our idea of truth or from the modernist conception of the social. As Emile Durkheim once put it, a society free of lawlessness, and I'm quoting, would fall into chaos, since it would be bereft of the signs of its own existence as a normative order. Functionalist sociology, of course, has long seen criminality as a means for preserving legality. But my concern in the first instance is with the semiotic side of Durkheim's observation, with the humanist notion of crime as sign. This notion was closely tied to the rise in the 19th century of the practice of detection, a hyper-rational mode of producing truth that no less an authority, no less a sociologist than Sherlock Holmes would call the art of reasoning backwards, of deciphering the hidden meaning of illegal acts and their authorship from the traces they left behind. Crime detection, says South African author Margie Orford, puts trust in the fact that every felony has a socially recognizable grammar. As a result, the slightest evidence it leaves in its wake may be decoded, thus to reveal its perpetrators and their motives. But what of situations in which this trust wavers, in which a population loses faith in its ability to make sense of violent transgressive behavior in its midst, in which the signs seem to have become occulted, the grammar scrambled, in which the drama of enforcement no longer appears capable of conjuring an authoritative, ordered reality, or indeed a legible social world. The word clue derives from clue, C-L-E-W, a ball of yarn. Victorians took it to refer tangibly to a thread whose unraveling might lead to the light beyond the labyrinth. A similar understanding, a sense of indexical connection between observable human actions and visible social structures, was integral to the epistemology of late 19th century sociology. Detection and social analysis were the offspring of a twin birth. Detectives were compelling figures in Victorian fiction, Franco Moretti argues, because they responded to deep anxiety in an expanding world about the very possibility of normative control. The virtuoso investigator embodied the liberal vision of scrutability. His reassuring gaze was capable, and I quote, of knowing, ordering, and defining the significant data of individual existence, and of relating them to society as a unitary, knowable body. Moretti here could well have been describing the founding tenets of social science. Early detectives of note, both real and fictional, displayed a genius for social diagnostics. They had an uncanny capacity to unravel the threads, the clues that link superficial signs to deeper truths, to rules and regularities inaccessible by other methods. A method itself Carlo Ginzburg dubs the conjectural paradigm of semiotics. In addition to an uncommon attention to detail and superior powers of inference, this technique required a confident command of cultural knowledge, an ability to read identities and intentions within putatively stable frameworks of meanings and relations. But there was more to the ingenuity of legendary 19th century detectives like Inspector Witcher of the London Metropolitan Police or Poe's Chevalier Auguste Dupin. Above all, They were inspired ethnographers, criminal anthropologists, if you like, although not in the mode of Darwinians like Lombroso or Galton, who sought to tie criminal types to innate physiological traits. Rather, like ethnographers, they relied in large part on first-hand participant observation of everyday activity, displaying a brilliant facility for reading the tiny details, the inadvertent habits, the nods and winks that for Clifford Geertz encode thick local meaning. In properly anthropological fashion, Sherlock Holmes insisted on the non-obvious significance of obvious facts, their capacity to disclose elementary truths. His fondness for the elementary was one of the many things he shared with Durkheim. In like manner, Holmes maintained that bizarre or magical events could be shown by a reasoned unraveling to be the product of all too recognizable human intentions and emotions. The very same has been said of the efforts of classic ethnographers to demystify European assumptions about phenomena like witchcraft, totemism, or cannibalism. But to restate the question, what do we make of historical contexts in which public faith in the conjectural paradigm of semiotics, what Sherlock Holmes called common sense systematized, is radically undermined, where trust in the currency of ordinary inference is eroded, where the mystery that haunts even the most robust empiricist ideas of detection becomes flagrantly visible, where, in short, faith is lost in the ability to explain lawlessness, and with it, possibly, the nature of society itself. In July 1997, South African TV aired what it described as one of the few success stories in a police force that had almost collapsed under the strain of democracy. It focused on Jackson Chopane, an inspector specializing in murder investigations in Limpopo, a province with a very high incidence of homicide. In South Africa, murder rates are held to be diagnostic of violence run amok, of governance haunted by a past of inequities that no constitutional reform, no rights of reconciliation can fully dispel. Especially indicative is the failure of the police to protect the populace, to win the war between crime and punishment that for many has turned the post-colony into a Hobbesian war zone. On this unruly terrain, Chopani was unusually adept at tracking down killers. Indeed, he was no ordinary cop. In the course of his work, he moved between the forensic and the oracular, detection and divination, exchanging his uniform and his gun for the dress and demeanor of a traditional healer. In him, scientific investigation met the social diagnostics of the seance. He was, in short, South Africa's first officially recognized diviner detective, but there would be others. Now, this is a particularly local tale, a tale of the unexpected as a notorious racial state morphs into a popular democracy. But the story of Chopane suggests something more, that the end of the ancien regime here might have brought with it the end of viable governance in the modernist mold of Max Weber. Government capable of sustaining a monopoly over the legitimate use of force, over the political process, over the limits of incivility. Hence the widespread conviction, especially among whites and the new black middle class, that policing is ineffective, that an economy of violence and corruption has taken root, that civil and moral order can no longer be presumed. Constitutional reform here came hand in hand with economic deregulation, liberation with liberalization, privatizing many of the functions of government, including in part the means of enforcement. Under these conditions, the very nature of authority becomes ambiguous, making it hard to distinguish legitimate from illegitimate violence, and those who preserve the law from those who pervert it. In the upshot, the metaphysical basis of order itself is called into question. Where the apartheid state enforced a racial geography of segregation, the social world now seems to be in riotous motion, driven by a heady mix of enfranchisement, eroding boundaries, and entrepreneurial incitement, all of which scrambles received signs of personal identity. The line between friend and enemy citizen and alien, seems hard to draw in a society awash with ever less recognizable others. In these times, writes Ahmad Danko, and I quote him, "You never know who is innocent and who isn't, which bland smile during the day will turn into a murderous smirk at night." Unquote. Now, Danko's nightmare conjures with a cliché. An obsessive drama of crime and punishment grips the South African imaginary at all levels, edging aside older fantasies like the Rainbow Nation or a people born in struggle. The obsession is not inevitable. South Africa exhibits high rates of lawlessness, to be sure, but the public fixation far exceeds the facticity of crime, its hard stats, its sociologic. Fear is demonstratively disproportionate to risk. More to the point, though, South Africans are also captured by images of law and disorder. The more dire, the better, whether they are the stuff of avid rumor or investigative journalism, of homegrown TV or high theater, of portentous documentaries or pulp fiction. What is more, their preoccupation is tauntingly ambivalent. In the spirit of Walter Benjamin, audacious crime fascinates, which is unsurprising in a place long colonized by the violence of the law, where iconoclastic enterprise is extolled, and where the lure of new commodity-fired identities goes along with widespread poverty and joblessness. On the other hand, the growth of crime as production has eroded the hard-won right of the population to the protection of person and property. As a result, there is a tendency in South Africa to see lawlessness as predictable, yet palpably excessive, mundane, yet mysterious, cynical, yet spectral. This is not confined to South Africa, of course, nor are the transformations of economy and society that have given rise to it. What is notable about South Africa, however, is that most of its citizens believe violent crime here to be unique, epic, exceptional. Buttressed by facts of various kinds, their belief is reiterated over and over in the persuasive language of numbers. Often it turns out faux numbers, mythostats, that as they circulate, take on the truth value of quantitative urban legends. Local criminologists remind us that similar anxieties surfaced after World War II, that rape and murder rates have probably been elevated here for decades, that more people die of AIDS, heart disease, traffic accidents than from criminal violence, that local felony rates resemble those in other structurally similar places. They add that political change often ushers in periods of moral ambiguity, legal uncertainty, and social disorder, be it in late 18th century France or America after the Civil War, in post-socialist Central Europe, democratizing Latin America, or Egypt after its recent revolution. In this light, South Africa is decidedly unexceptional. But almost every day, headlines affirm the opposite, feeding a desire for details at once apocalyptic and banal. Almost every day, too, the media carry reports of police ineptitude and corruption, this notwithstanding the extraordinary difficulties under which police actually toil, the dangers they confront with their daily dice with death, or the fact that conviction rates here are not very different from those in other advanced countries, like the UK. Many remain convinced that democracy has, with tragic irony, deprived them of their basic right to safety and protection. Scholars claim that half of the populace now invests in private or community security, which in turn reinforces a culture of fear. As darkness falls, a strident urban symphony strikes up, a furious fugue of car and burglar alarms, often tripped by their wary owners, thus to compound the confusion of reality and myth. And nightly, in what are their expensively secured living rooms, people feed an insatiable appetite for mass-mediated crime shows, be they local or fictional, foreign or docudrama. Especially alluring are the exploits of unorthodox cops, not unlike Gopani, who sally forth in the public interest. Investigators possessed of an inspired ability to detect the pattern that underlies the mystery, the metaphysic of disorder, so palpable in the here and now. How might we understand the simultaneous faith and distrust in the possibilities of enforcement? And what light might it cast on the Durkheimian axiom that from crime goes forth the law? Walter Benjamin had it that the power of the police is ghostly because their all-pervasive violence takes over at the point where the state fails to govern by ordinary means. To be sure, memories of the all-pervasive violence of apartheid remain vivid to many South Africans, and in some respects the state is very present in this post-colony. But these days, many are beset by a spookiness of a different kind, by a feeling that the forces of order are enigmatic and unreliable, that government has withdrawn from its subjects, that authority has dispersed itself into murky privatized parastatals, NGOs, transnational corporations, and corrupt cartels, or in arcane fusions of all these things. Where once the police seemed panoptical, manically tracking the movements of everyone, they now appear disengaged, almost spectral in their absence. The monopolization of violence that for Benjamin grounds the harsh law of the modern state, and for Hobbes founds its social contract, is in question here, rendering law, order, and sovereignty ambiguous, often unfathomable. Now, how might all of this be related to issues with which we began? To the robust faith, as if from another age, in the idea of society as lawful order, faith also in social forensics that may tie the conditions of individual being to a coherent, legible world. By way of an answer, let me describe a clutch of cases, each in its way diagnostic of uncertain times. Drawn from the annals of crime and policing in contemporary South Africa, all of them express ambivalence about the possibility of setting law apart from lawlessness. Together, they bespeak a loss of trust in the will or the capacity of the state to enforce order. But they also suggest something more disquieting still, that there may be no recoverable grammar to this destabilized world, no way of connecting surface appearances to enduring social identities or trusted truths, at least not by received rational means. Extraordinary times, it seems, demand extraordinary measures. The first case goes back to the creation of the occult-related crimes unit, note the occult-related crimes unit, within the South African Police Service in 1992, when democratization was in full swing amidst rampant violence and public anxiety. While it had roots in both African and Afrikaner supernaturalism, the immediate impetus for its establishment came from the US, where popular concerns about satanic ritual abuse, acutely captured in Lawrence Wright's Remembering Satan, 1994, had given rise to the Cult Crime Awareness Network. While the mandate of the South African unit was to investigate illegal acts resulting from any occult science or belief system, it focused on homicides stemming from witchcraft. Echoes here of a long colonial struggle to impose the rule of law on the African uncanny. Its moving spirit was one Colonel Kobus Jonker, widely nicknamed Donker, which is dark in Afrikaans. A seasoned officer, Donker Jonker, was a born-again Christian, known in the media as God's detective. Sharp and dedicated, he was devoted to tracking down killers. Jonker refused a distinction between diabolical beliefs and felonies. In his view, Satanism and witchcraft were at root the same phenomenon, both leading inevitably to deadly violence. Jonker's legal theology tended towards the apocalyptic. The devil, he once declared, has made a revolutionary reappearance in the new South Africa. These fears resonated with rising angst about Satanism and witchcraft in both black and white communities. The avid embrace of born-again faiths in recent years points to a more ontological insecurity that has accompanied the birth of the post-colony. Ivan Vladislavich calls it the exploded view, a sense of expansion, implosion, edginess, a loss of known coordinates. On this disrupted terrain, authority is inchoate, identity inscrutable, agency opaque. Mundane communicative acts, Vladislavich says, often take the form of a sign language from a secret alphabet. Could Jonker decipher this alphabet? The occult-related crimes unit worked hard to promote public awareness of the threat of satanic subcultures, offering training workshops for civic organizations concerned to combat the spectral hazards haunting this estranged landscape. It also sought to introduce a new kind of policing capable of dealing with these hazards. Jonker was preoccupied above all with making occult-related crimes susceptible to prosecution. Despite the popular opinion that there was an epidemic of magical evil afoot in the land, very few homicides associated with witchcraft, ritual murder, or Satanism have actually come to court. It is not merely that South African law does not recognize witchcraft as a justiciable category. The police, Jonker noted, are incapable even of recognizing evidence of occult activity, nor are they able to discern the identities and motives it entails. Existing forensic techniques are unable to detect the traces of these enigmatic crimes of our times. This is why the unit has spent so much time on education. Its personnel believe fervently that if spectral evil is effectively to be fought, both the police and the public have to be taught to apprehend its signs, the signs it leaves behind. Jonker gave us a personal tutorial on these signs, describing hard-to-visualize materia medica and showing us objects, ostensibly with covert ritual purposes, housed in a private teaching museum adjoining his office at police headquarters. Now, a parenthesis here. It could be argued that modernist detection has never been fully separated from the divining arts. Foundational writers, from Poe to Pinkerton, might have emphasized the rational, empiricist basis of their craft. But their prose flirts with something else. The master crime analyst, says Poe, and I quote him, exhibits in his solutions a degree of acumen which appears to the ordinary apprehension as preternatural, especially in contrast with the plodding procedures of regular policing. Anthropologist Hilda Cooper saw the detective as the extra-legal Superman who must accomplish by extraordinary methods what is seemingly impossible by established means. Abduction was the term used by semiotician Charles Peirce to capture these extraordinary measures. Peirce, note, was an avid reader of Poe and had tried his own hand at detection. Abduction for him was the mode of conjecture, the flash of insight that yields testable hypotheses. Here again is the parallel with ethnography. Edmund Leach famously claimed that at its best, anthropology was inspired guesswork. Poe and Peirce both mused on what it was that allowed gifted investigators to move beyond the obvious, that permitted them prophetically to generate new knowledge by unusual means. Here the mystical enters into the equation. Peirce once referred to abduction as a divine privilege, a means of communication between man and his creator. He and Jonker would have understood each other well. For his part, Jonker appeared often on television to popularize his work. His website was set out as a public resource. Documentary features about him were filmed by respected network series in the US and the UK. Despite the unease with which his crusade was viewed by many of the police mainstream, he was tolerated, precisely because he tackled a conundrum not resolvable by regular means. Whatever they thought of his enchanted theories, his colleagues needed him. Once, while we were in his office, the Archbishop of Cape Town telephoned him to arrange an urgent meeting. The divine, it appears, needed the detective. Jonker remains in the public eye, serving as an international consultant on occult crime. When the mutilated body of a boy, thought to be African, was pulled from the River Thames in 2001, Scotland Yard cited his expert testimony to confirm that the child was a victim of ritual murder. This evoked the accusation, especially by Africanist scholars, that for all its scientific credentials, the Yard remained prone to primitivist stereotypes, succumbing to the racist myths of Satan-hunting fundamentalists. Similar controversy surrounds the theories promulgated by American cult cops, whose popular seminars on satanic crime have been offered for continuing education credit to police in several states, and still are. Critics argue that this recycles reactionary religious views which target minority cultural practices, among them Mexican-American and Afro-Caribbean rituals like Santeria. The debate underscores the perception that conventional policing is sorely challenged in a world in which causes and motives seem ever more impenetrable. It also inflates the fantasy that diviner detectives can unravel the mystery, can plumb the murk that defies ordinary law enforcement. The story of the Scorpions, South Africa's crack unit established to deal with priority crimes, seems all the more mundane. But it too was to take on fantastic proportions, casting these cops as unlikely superheroes in the struggle for criminal justice and national order. It all began in the late 1990s, when the idyll of liberation was giving way to harsher post-colonial realities. The country had become embroiled in a series of scandals, exemplified by the so-called arms deal, a controversial $4.8 billion package contracted by the ANC regime to modernize its defense equipment. Debate raged in the media and halls of government over the need for this expenditure, fed by accusations that powerful politicians were enriching themselves at public expense, and that international manufacturers had bribed local subcontractors and military personnel. As tension mounted, the leader of the opposition Pan-African Congress, who had called for an independent inquiry into the matter, handed a dossier of incriminating documents to Willem Heath, head of the Special Investigation Unit. Heath had been an apartheid-era judge and now proved fearless in pursuing malfeasance among the rich and the powerful. Unusually, his authority blended the investigative and the prosecutorial. He had the right to subpoena witnesses and documents, to seize and search, and to indict. Heath, who had a liking for theatrics, was widely accused of exceeding his mandate. Having swapped his musty robes for a Superman outfit, as one journalist quipped, he behaved like a rampant cowboy on the frontier. All this proved immensely popular with those longing for an uncompromising enactment of the law. As the battle surged around the arms deal, then President Mbeki issued a demand on national TV that Heath hand over the documents, declaring that his unit was an organ of state that had run out of control, precipitating a situation of ungovernability. Faced with a refusal to comply, Mbeki announced plans to reconstitute Heath's unit. And so in 2001, the new improved unit, comprising some of the best police, financial, and intelligence experts, came into being. Trained by the FBI and christened the Scorpions, it retained the form of prosecutor-led investigation initiated by its forerunner. It also inherited its aura of crusading machismo. The Scorpions behaved like US soap stars, noted the BBC. They'd screech up to suspects' homes in fast cars and step out in FBI-type jumpsuits, bulletproof vests and killer shades. It was thrilling, unless it was you that they were after. This image was reinforced by the Scorpions' iconography. Their webpage featured a hooded cobra ready to strike against corruption. It also made it possible to download ringtones featuring a menacing heavy metal band by the same name. Gritty TV footage of photogenic super cops on a raid drew rave ratings on YouTube. Clearly, the Scorpions were no less able than was Judge Heath to resist the popular craving for forensic spectacle. As they set about their mission as crime busters extraordinaire, the media stressed the contrast between them and the slipshod South African police. The press spoke of their uncanny ability to break into esoteric webs of global corporate corruption and money laundering with novel techniques of forensic accountancy, establishing them as divine detectives of finance capital and high-end fraud. Admiring reports detailed their putatively preternatural power to outwit corporate criminals, to secure mythic conviction rates, to recover misappropriated public funds. Drug kingpins, smugglers, and racketeers have all felt the Scorpion's sting, ran one report. Another claimed that a major gang that smuggled platinum, South Africa's biggest foreign exchange earner, to Britain, had been bust. Crusading detectives here were seen to defend the national patrimony against neo-colonial adventurers, dealers in illegal diamonds, contraband minerals, endangered species. But what really secured their superhero status with the public was the zeal with which they investigated government corruption. Televised raids were staged on the homes of ANC politicians, like then Deputy President Jacob Zuma, and businessmen, one of whom was convicted of bribing Zuma on behalf of a French company bidding for a share of the arms deal. In the upshot, Mbeki fired Zuma, who was duly indicted for corruption. Released on bail and cleared of a rape charge, Zuma emerged as a populist hero. For their part, the Scorpions continued to pursue him. In a protracted melodrama that enthralled the nation, they raided his homes, again with fulsome TV coverage, taking documents and hard drives. Even more spectacularly, they cordoned off the seat of government in Pretoria, bringing the state to a halt as they pored over papers potentially relevant to their case. And while their extravagant exploits thrilled the public, they drew criticism from some quarters amidst accusation of Hollywood theatrics and an openness to political manipulation. Undaunted, the Scorpions then conducted an equally surreal investigation of none other than Jackie Selebi, head of the South African Police Service and world president of Interpol. A colorful character, Selebi was long rumored to fraternize with felons. Although Mbeki tried to shield him, he was in court by January 2008, there to be sentenced to 15 years for corruption. It is remarkable, given all this, that the Scorpions lasted as long as they did. By 2006, few in office were not threatened by their sting. The election of the irrepressible Zuma as leader of the ANC and heir to the presidency in December 2007 sealed their fate. The party congress that anointed him also called for the Scorpions' dissolution, alleging that they had acted like an opposition party fighting the government. Howls went up across the nation. The parliamentary opposition accused the regime of protecting its new leader and preempting further investigation into the arms deal. Editorials and blogs complained that the unit was being punished for its success. There were even calls for a national referendum. The destruction of the Scorpions, wrote respected journalist Mondi Makandle, is an issue which civil society, organized business, and the silent majority should use to put our democracy to the test. Prince Mashele of the Institute for Security Studies noted that for ordinary South Africans, the Scorpions had become a trusted savior. Their demise, he added, sounded a death knell to the country's respect for the rule of law. Pollsters claimed that 2/3 of South Africans agreed. An online petition, SOS, Save Our Scorpions, gathered thousands of signatures. Others took to the judiciary. A Johannesburg businessman filed suit to prevent government from destroying the unit. This as demonstrators outside the hearing held aloft a giant plastic scorpion. The case was subsequently upheld on appeal by the Constitutional Court. The Scorpions had, in other words, become a fetish. Dissolved in 2009, the unit was widely heralded for its prodigious power to probe the moral murk, for its dazzling ability to conjure evidence, for its capacity to restore the fantasy of sovereign justice. It had come to stand for the very possibility of social order. Uncanny was the adjective most commonly used to describe its effects. My third case takes us far from the orbit of national melodrama. Drawn from the archive of everyday enforcement in the rural Northwest province, it illuminates a different face of forensic anxiety, the poignant popular faith that cops might be able, against all odds, to solve novel mysteries born of perplexing times, a faith which the now predominantly Africanized police, especially in small communities, often feel compelled to respond to, even when they lack the means. In January 2000, our attention was drawn to a troubling case that had been brought to the cops at Lomanyaneng, a village near Mafeking, headquarters of the police service in this Tswana-speaking province. The liaison officer there, Captain Patrick Asaneng, first told us about it. A lay leader in the Catholic Church, he was to be deeply involved in it as a diviner detective of sorts. The trouble began in a desperately poor homestead of the Sejake family with a series of strange events. An intruder had entered the mud house, in which slept an elderly grandmother and 2 grandsons, the first of whom, Tsamaiso, was 12. The father, Abed, was away seeking work, but would return later in the night in question. The mother of the boys was estranged. She lived out there, said the old woman, gesturing vaguely across the veld. The family had few local ties, living amidst the miscellany of migrants who had drifted into the area since the end of apartheid. The invisible assailant had harassed the Sejakes with obvious violence. It, as we shall see, the source of the trouble was not quite human, set upon Tsamaiso, swore volubly at everybody in this quiet household, and destroyed most of their few possessions. Nor was this the only attack. The Sejakes were repeatedly spat at, pinched, and throttled at night. Another onslaught, even more extraordinary, involved photographs. From a local newspaper, the family had cut out an article about their case, complete with photographs, among them an unforgettably doleful portrait of the grandmother. This image had been thumbtacked to a framed picture of the Kaiser Chiefs, the country's most popular soccer team. The attacker had wrenched the whole thing from the shelf and hurled it against the wall of the front room. Clearly, it was offended by the effort to frame it. Soon after they were set upon, the Sejake family had gone to lay a charge of assault at Lomanyaneng police station. This in itself is noteworthy. During the apartheid years, Africans as a rule did not expect protection from the law, which was largely in the hands of whites. The desk officer at Lomanyaneng found it hard to translate the Sejake's complaint into the language of charges and dockets. Patently there had been an assault, but who was the assailant? A Tokolosh, said Obed, Tsamaiso's father, who was later accused of trying to strangle him. Tokolosh, as all South Africans know, is a squat, hairy witch familiar whose cultural home was once confined to the eastern Nguni-speaking region of the country. But Tokoloshes, which terrify those who afflict them, have also become more mobile since the end of apartheid, having recently migrated into new parts of the country. One of them, the Sejake family believed, was causing their affliction. The police at Lomanyaneng, all of them Africans, took the case seriously. For several nights, they allowed Obed and Tsamaiso to take refuge at the station. Apart from all else, Tsamaiso had been grievously hurt, and property in the house had been destroyed. Nothing was missing, so there was no question of robbery. Nor was there any evidence that this family had fallen into conflict with neighbors, kin, or anyone else. But how could the police track down a Tokolosh? Given that they could not arraign the witch familiar, or knew how to return it to its owner, what was to be done? How was the spirit of the law to deal with spirits of a very different kind? This clearly was a case for the occult-related crimes unit, but it was very far away. Indeed, the local police called in Captain Asaneng from regional headquarters. Asaneng confessed that the case presented a conundrum. No crime had been committed, yet the family did have cause to complain of assault and the destruction of property. A serious disturbance had occurred. Hence, despite the fact that it fell outside the sphere of their conventional practice, the police felt called upon to respond. They did so by drawing on a synthetic, unconventional repertoire of techniques in the grey zone between enforcement and healing. Asaneng visited the Sejakes, first with the local media and later with a prophet healer. He said he'd taken the local TV team and 2 newspapers on the off chance that the publicity might draw forth assistance from the community. Above all, though, he sought to divine the cause of the trouble by apprehending it on film. But the Tokolosh eluded the TV cameras. Inexplicably, they ran on fast forward all the time they were inside the haunted house. Out of sync with the force it sought to capture, the tape was unviewable. Now, there are many ironies here. Asaneng hoped that the camera would solve the mystery, shades of Benjamin again, who posited a close allegiance between the space of photography and the scene of the crime. For him, the photographer was a descendant of the augur, or the diviner, being able to turn traces invisible to the naked eye into evidence, thus to subject them to the law. But with the tokoloshe, the alchemy failed, as if to underscore the elusiveness of the occult and the challenge, under current conditions, of subjecting inscrutable acts to modern forensics. The Sajekes, for their part, had different expectations. Recalling the widely noted African belief that spirits can be apprehended by the camera, they thought that the photographs might catch the intruder and carry it away. They wished, that is, for abduction of a rather literal kind. But the tokoloshe had apparently been too canny. Uncannily so, it responded with fury, destroying the image objects that had sought to capture it. Meanwhile, in the wake of all the publicity, healers and religious leaders of various stripes, from Catholic priests to traditional doctors, also offered their services. They prayed, they divined, they placed clans of medicine on the roof, they buried ritual horns in the ground, all to no avail. We had to leave the Northwest for a while, and when we returned, the officers at Lomanyaneng reported that the matter at Matlonyane had taken a turn for the better. When, together with the beat cop on the case, we drew up in front of the Sejake household, we found Samaiso playing happily in the sun. His grandmother ushered us in and reported that for 2 months the family had been free from attack. In the end, she herself had found a ngaka, a diviner, who had treated the home and its occupants. The healer had used various medicaments which had been hung from the rafters of the house. Where had she found someone to succeed where all others had failed? The officiant, it turned out, was a co-member of the Church of God, one of the many Pentecostal congregations that offer succor and security in communities like this. In desperation, they had consulted her and been told that the affliction was tractable. The grandmother insisted that the identity of the assailant who had sent the tokoloshe was moot, although she suspected her estranged daughter-in-law. When we discussed the outcome with Captain Asaneng, he remarked, "Sometimes the best solution is the one closest to home, the one within grasp." It was an acute observation, but it was also an admission of failure. Despite their often creative efforts to rein in the assailants, invading the intimate reaches of post-colonial life, police regularly stumble over the grammar of contemporary crime that sometimes takes unprecedented forms. Notwithstanding the popular desire for protection, there remains a crisis of trust in their ability to prevail, one made manifest in the burgeoning resort to unconventional efforts to plumb the mysteries of the everyday. In 2007, one of the most sensational, controversial murder trials in South African legal history came before the Cape High Court. The evidence against Fred van der Vyver, accused of murdering his girlfriend Inge Lotz in Stellenbosch, the heartland of modern Afrikaner history, looked overwhelming. Both his fingerprints and a bloody tread of one of his shoes were allegedly found at the scene of the crime. But as the action unfolded, the defense picked the prosecution's case apart, clue by painstaking clue, using international experts to challenge the unique traces that the police used to implicate van der Vyver. In an astute account of the hearing, Anthony Altbecker remarks that while it was never framed as such, the trial was really about how objects and artifacts ought to be read. Not only did it cast deep doubt on the truthfulness of the police involved, most of them seasoned detectives, it called into question their deployment of conventional forensic techniques and the interpretation of clues. In so doing, and this is the point, it shook an entire culture of evidentiary practice inherited from the colonial past. Note that fingerprints were first used in a colonial context in British India as a means to authenticate individual identity. In imposing order after the Sepoy Mutiny of 1858, the Raj turned to body marks to identify unruly subjects who all looked alike. This technique continues to be trusted today despite its acknowledged fallibilities and the ascent of DNA technology, often itself, of course, called fingerprinting, as the authoritative means of marking identity. The fixation on fingerprinting points to an enduring desire, one that in our rush to critique panoptical power, we scholars often underappreciate. The popular yearning in uncertain times for states to have the ability to know and to acknowledge each of their subjects individually. Which is why in the post-colonial moment, when identities again have become hard to read, when the truth seems elusive, such store was put on fingerprint technology in the Van der Vyver trial. And why, as it fell apart, faith in the police and in ordinary forensics fell apart with it. Recall Durkheim's vision. It was in crime, he believed, that modern society found the signs of its own existence as a normative socio-moral order. Whether we read this as sociology or ideology, it raises the spectre of an inversion, that in the absence of a reflexive sense of discernible order, of shared truths and the means of producing them, crime becomes unreadable, mysterious, explosive. No wonder then that the Van der Vyver trial was taken as a symptom of a justice system stretched to breaking point. The case, like the others we explore here, reveals a profound distrust in the ability of a society to know itself, to put faith in its interpretive instincts, to preserve a grammar of self-recognition on which social knowledge, forensic or otherwise, may be based. For as Altbecker notes, the gap between crime and what we know about it has to be filled by evidence, evidence whose meaning in the final analysis is to be divined, his word. Divined, that is, by inspired guesswork, made all the more urgent as an imagined social world seems to explode. Could this be why, in the face of the criminal obsessions that have gripped South Africa and other contemporary places like it, the drama of crime and detection carries such inordinate political charge, such extraordinary cultural appeal, such strong, excessive affect? Why the Gopanis, the Yonkers, the Scorpions, and the likes of Patrick Asaneng have such magnetic allure? Does that affective excess explain the fetishism, after both Marx and Freud, of those uniquely capable, in myth or in reality, of imposing law on lawlessness, of restoring a noble norm-governed world? And could it be that, in true Freudian fashion, super cops of various kinds serve as stand-ins for a profound sense of lack? To be sure, they draw attention to feelings of fatal exile from the promise of security ascribed in the fantasy of paternalist state protection. While these sentiments may be especially marked in South Africa these days, this is hardly the only context where older political imaginaries are overwhelmed by deregulation, by transformation, by explosions of scale, in which the complex interplay of state and market has rendered authority ambiguous, inscrutable, ghostly. Here, questions about the basis of law and government often take on a theological cost, as both scholars and citizens turn to the revelatory and the messianic in their effort to restore legibility and to revalue the currency of common sense. The diviner detective may be an apt embodiment of the paradoxes of law, order, and sovereignty in places and times rapidly outrunning the logos of modernity. But this figure also personifies a persisting faith in the possibility of a legible world. As in divination, so in social analysis. Carlo Ginzburg insists that the sheer complexity of the advanced capitalist world may make the idea of systemic knowledge appear fanciful. But the impossibility of foregoing easy connections between surface and substrate does not nullify what he calls the existence of a deep connection between them. As he says, reality is opaque, but there are clues, symptoms, which still allow us to decipher it. Clues, again, that draw together the ethnographer and the diviner detective, that call for a criminal anthropology capable of making sense of our labile world and the force fields that configure it. Thank you. What happens now? Sure, if anybody has any, that's fine. We could also go and have a drink.
failure of, he was not convicted, obviously, he was acquitted.
No, he wasn't.
But in that case, it doesn't seem to me that it's obvious that it led to a feeling of failure of a society to know itself. It seems to me it just led to a division in the society, in which everyone was quite certain about whether someone was innocent or not, and the jury nullification process was part of it. At least that was part of the interpretation. I'm wondering, was there a jury in the case that you described? And how do you see the connection between what happened in the O.J. Simpson case and what happened in that case in what at least might be two very different kinds of societies?
Yeah. Thank you. And in fact, there's probably more of a connection even to the O.J. Simpson case that was apparent here, because right now, John and I have been spending time sitting in court, because in fact, there's now a civil suit. Van der Veef is now suing the police for frivolous, arrest and so on, frivolous trial. Look, what I'm suggesting here is not, I'm suggesting a kind of tautology, a circularity. I'm not suggesting that it's because the likes of the Van der Veef case that there is a sense that we don't know ourselves. The very question of why the distrust arose in the first place informs a forensic practice that had been used by the apartheid state in this way with those same, most of these detectives in this case were white, right? The very fact that there was a crack opened suggested that there was a question of a breach of trust. What came up in much of the evidence was really quite fascinating. It turned on the question of who these young people were, what it was to be an Afrikaner now. That these were young people who, first of all, belonged not to a traditional Dutch Reformed church, but a Pentecostal congregation, right? And that it came out in the context of the trial that they had very strange and quite sort of worldly ideas, that they fraternized with drug dealers in the town. They were worldly in a sense that was very unrecognizable by traditional Afrikaner canons. And one of the key questions was, who are these people? But one of the other dimensions that became so fascinating in this trial was that there had always been, as there have been here, we've put fingerprints on trial in various places. We know, in many senses, that the reading of fingerprints is often more a divinatory exercise than anything else. And there have been times where there have been very serious efforts to come to the brink and say, look, this evidence is not acceptable. It just isn't. We can't use this. But we stepped back from it. In the South African case, what was fascinating was that the whole thing was torn wide open. And people began to raise questions about the difference between South African, American, and English ways of reading fingerprints, for instance. And got to the point where the language, and Altbecker, who's a criminologist, is using language like divination. So while the case reinforced the sense that justice was impossible, what I'm suggesting is that where there is that sense that the world is unreadable, the scale is exploded, the normal ways of assuming who the usual suspects are, who the enemy is, where you go for evidence and how you read that evidence, have been profoundly disrupted. And it's in that context where the cycle of distrust begins to unravel. And there's effort increasingly, almost obsessionally, to go back to the trial, to the case of crime and punishment, as a way of trying to force that order again, to draw that line in a stable way. And yet in the very process, the inability to do that comes to the fore. And a lot of it is around this question of who do we trust? What is evidence? Where do we look for motives? How do we begin even to put a case together? Now, I mean, in the American case, there are parallels and of all kinds, but not in this precise way, right? I think the earlier moment that I referred to in the Remembering Satan case was a very interesting one, where there were a whole series of cases around things that looked like, for instance, abuse trials, recovered memory, and so on, which really challenged the judicial system at this point as to what was justiciable and what was evidence. And that was an earlier moment after the Cold War, a loss of known coordinates, an explosion of scale. Lawrence Wright writes about worlds, for instance, where the only industries in town had suddenly packed up and gone south of the border, and NAFTA was beginning to reconfigure people's sense of where they stood in the world and what were the boundaries of your polity and so on. So that's the kind of parallel. But there are parallels, of course. But the particular formation here, I'm suggesting, is probably more closely mirrored in places like Central Europe, post-transitional societies in the first instance, right?
I really enjoyed this fascinating lecture. I'd like to take you back briefly, though, from the cases in South Africa to the very beginning of your talk.
Yeah.
To Sherlock Holmes in the UK. As it happens, one of my forebears was Sir Henry Littlejohn, who is a professor of forensic medicine at the University of Edinburgh. He and Bell were real-life bases for... Anyhow, it strikes me, those of us who are affiliated with universities are into the search for truth at one level or another and in various different fields. But one of the things that fascinates me about forensic activities and even detective stories is that the search for truth leads on, at least in principle, to justice. That seeking truth can have the effect of arriving at justice.
Yeah.
That always seemed to me to be one of the fascinations of these fields. Mm-hmm. Just a comment.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, in fact, what underlies a good deal of the work that we're doing right here now is not only the quest for justice, but the often slippage between law and justice, right? And the fascination of the detective, often the rogue detective, right? Yeah, the unconventional detective, who marks out the difference between himself and, as I kept trying to say, the slipshod, plodding police, right? And this is, of course, a theme in detective fiction from Sherlock Holmes onwards, right? And the gumshoe in America in the 1930s, where there was real distrust in government, its capacity to provide, and to provide even social and economic justice, and the faith put in these other kind of rogue, if you like, figures who can critique the law and hold it accountable, and sometimes move beyond it, and even the kind of Clint Eastwood figure of, the kind of search for justice that in a way can only be found outside the realms of the law. So the quest for justice is part of the story here, definitely, yeah. But the issue here also is the sense, I think, and there's more at issue in what I'm trying to suggest, it's also this question of justice not only in terms of the law, but in terms of recognition by a state, protection by the police, the ushering into a world where the law works for the majority, as it never did in South Africa, for instance, under apartheid conditions, where in fact the law was the enemy, right? So just at the moment where people feel they have been ushered in, ideally, to the protection of the law, to constitutional citizenship, there's the sense that something has overtaken them, right? And the ordinary forces of law are not either protecting them or indeed living up to the promise of what liberation was going to provide. And that's where the material conditions that I'm talking about here come into play. Yeah? And this is where the faith in these various kinds of alternatives, those who can actually read the signs, those who can make the system work, those who can deliver justice, not only in terms of solving crimes, but in the more general sense of relating people in an orderly manner as citizens to a society that knows, that counts, that recognizes, that can set good from evil. That's part of what's going on here. And I think both in the fictional sense and in the case of these show trials, this is increasingly the kind of allegory, the melodrama in which people seek to experiment with these ideas and force them to happen. In fantasy, if not fully in life, but also to try and goad the state into action.
Okay, so I'd like to thank Jean once again, and as I know you all share my enthusiasm for thanking her, and